Hello, my name is Andrew Oros, and I'm an associate professor of political science and international studies at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. And I'm here to talk today about Japan's contemporary security challenges in 2016 and looking beyond. So I'd like to begin this brief discussion by setting out the four topics I'd like to convey in the next 20 to 30 minutes. First, why you should care about Japan and US-Japan relations, or simply, why does Japan matter in 2016? Secondly, what's most important to know about Japan's post-World War II security policies in relation to contemporary challenges Japan faces? Third, what's new about Japan's recent security policies and its security environment? And relatedly, why do some in Japan and abroad find this topic about Japan's security policies so controversial? And fourth, what are the main security challenges Japan faces now and in the near future? So the first topic, why care about Japan and about US-Japan relations? Well, as most of you probably know if you're viewing this video, Japan is the 10th largest population country in the world at roughly 127 million. It's just slightly smaller than Russia, which is the ninth largest population at 142 million. And this population size is despite Japan being quite small in land mass, about the size of the state of California, my home state. Ambassador Mansfield, the former U.S. ambassador to Japan, would point to Montana, his home state, as being the closest U.S.-sized state to Japan's land mass. Japan's economy is the third largest in the world. I have a visual aid for that here. Japan is number 3, after the U.S. and China. China just surpassed the size of the Japanese economy in 2010. Also, Japan is the 5th largest military spender in the world, after the United States, China, Russia, and the United Kingdom. This fluctuates year by year, but Japan is consistently around the 5th or 6th largest military spender in the world, which is something that surprises many people, since many people have the view, mistakenly, that Japan doesn't have any armed forces. But still, despite being roughly the 5th largest military spender in the world, Japan spends about the same on its defense as the United States spends on just our intelligence budget alone. So although Japan is a large spender in the worldwide, in terms of US-Japan relations, Japan's spending is roughly 1/10 of what the US spends on defense in an average year. But beyond military security, there are other reasons why we might care about Japan and about US-Japan relations. Japan is number 2 for the United States on a number of fronts. Outside of North America, it's the number 2 source and destination for exports. It's the number 2 source of foreign direct investment in the United States, the number 2 foreign holder of US treasuries after China. But I'll point out that for Japan, the United States is also number 2 in one area, in that China has been Japan's largest trade partner since 2007. Finally, I'd like to note that Japanese have among the longest life expectancies in the world at 84 years. In part, this is because no Japanese soldier has died in combat in over 70 years since the end of the Second World War in 1945. Yet, looking forward, Japan's long life expectancy poses unexpected challenges for the Japanese economy and Japanese society. Today, Japan faces what's called a super-aging society, with a record low birth rate that poses both economic and security challenges. Finally, in why we should care about Japan and about US-Japan relations, we should look at the region in which Japan is located. Japan is located in a region facing numerous potentially catastrophic security challenges, catastrophic for Japan and also for the United States. If you look at the map and look at the areas that are circled in red, you can see a number of conflict hotspots that Japan faces. At the top of the circled area, you see the country of North Korea, which has been developing nuclear weapons for the past 20 years despite concerted efforts of North Korea's neighbors and the United States to contain this potential threat. Next down, we can see the circle around the Senkaku Islands, or what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands. This is disputed territory between Japan and China, and a potential conflict flashpoint that would involve the United States as well because of our military alliance with Japan. Next, you can see the island of Taiwan circled. This is territory that is claimed by China, but has effectively ruled itself independently since 1949. This territory is close by Japan, as you can see on the map, and also threatens to bring the whole region into conflict if a shooting war to break out between China and Taiwan. U.S. forces based in Japan, especially on the island of Okinawa, also may be involved in a Taiwan conflict, should one develop. Finally, the largest circle at the bottom is around the area of the South China Sea, where there are a number of territorial disputes that threaten world trade that pass through this area. The disputes include the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Taiwan, among others. Now I'd like to talk about early post-war Japan, meaning Japan immediately after World War II, and talk about some of the precedents and decisions that were made in this early period that continue to influence Japanese security policy today. First point I'd like to make is that security politics have always been very political and actively debated in Japan in the post-war period. It's not just recently that security policy has become politicized. In particular, the so-called Article 9 of Japan's post-war constitution, the constitution that was imposed during the American occupation of Japan and adopted in 1947. Article 9 prohibits Japan from possessing war potential and strictly limits how Japan provides for its self-defense in the post-war years. Recently, Prime Minister Abe and his Liberal Democratic Party have discussed openly the idea of adapting Article 9 for a new security environment, something I'll talk about later in this lecture. In the book Normalizing Japan, I argued that the basic framework for Japan's post-war security policies was settled around 1960, which was a year that the United States-Japan Security Treaty was revised and adopted by the Japanese Diet, Japan's parliament. Prior to that, in 1954, Japan reestablished a kind of military forces, which are called the self-defense forces, and continue to protect Japan today in a greatly expanded role compared to what was envisioned in 1954. Still, the overseas roles for the self-defense forces are quite limited, and Japan's self-defense forces, in fact, were not dispatched outside of Japan until after the Persian Gulf War in 1991. This general framework of a U.S.-Japan alliance, limited capabilities of the self-defense forces, and contentious politics around new approaches to security in Japan still sets the basic framework for Japan's security policies, even 55 years or more after this framework was originally established. But many question how much longer this basic framework is going to hold, especially after an important election that took place in Japan on July 10th of 2016, where for the first time the conservative Liberal Democratic Party and its allies now have won 2/3 of the seats in both houses of Japan's parliament, the threshold for implementing constitutional revision in Japan. I'd also like at the outset to say a few more words about U.S.-Japan relations, especially as it relates to security policy. The United States and Japan celebrated the 50th anniversary of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty in 2010, which is essentially a swap of U.S. access to bases in Japan in exchange for a U.S. security guarantee for Japan. Presently, about 50,000 U.S. troops are based in Japan. In addition, important U.S. military assets are located in Japan, including the USS Ronald Reagan nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which is the only U.S. carrier homeported outside of the United States. Today, more than 80% of Japanese report positive feelings towards the United States, and a similar number of Americans convey positive feelings towards Japan. Our alliance has come a long way since the original security treaty was signed in 1960. In addition to the U.S.-Japan military alliance, it's important to consider Japan's military forces on its own. Of course, Japan had an important public relations issue to address after the end of the Second World War, given the devastation that the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy had wrought on East Asia and on the United States and other Allied powers. But after over 60 years of concerted efforts to resuscitate Japan's image and to atone for Japan's past, today the Japanese people and Japanese policies are highly regarded in many places in the world. According to one prominent poll conducted by the BBC in 2012, Japan ranked among the highest of countries that played a positive role in the world. In 2013, it dropped to number 4, but still, among the countries polled, Japan was seen as playing a very positive role. Although Japan did face issues with two of its closest neighbors, China and South Korea, which of course present serious security concerns for Japan. This positive reputation didn't arise just by accident. The Japanese Foreign Ministry makes a serious effort to convey a positive image of Japan abroad. For example, it appoints an honorary ambassador, the Ambassador of Cute, or the Kawaii Taishi, who recently was a Japanese entertainer named Kimura Yu. You can check out her YouTube channel if you take a look. In addition, nearly everyone in the world would recognize the white cat who appears on the right of the screen. Hello Kitty, developed by the Sanrio Corporation, is among Asia's most recognizable brands, and another ambassador of cuteness for Japan. As Japan rebuilt its military, which it calls the Self-Defense Forces, an effort was also made to convey a very positive, peaceful message, even for a military force, beginning with its name, the Self-Defense Forces. As I mentioned before, the Self-Defense Forces were not deployed overseas until after the end of the Cold War in 1991, in the immediate aftermath of the Persian Gulf War, when Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force minesweepers assisted in demining the Persian Gulf. Since that time, the self-defense forces have been dispatched to about a dozen places around the world, but in very limited numbers, including, as you can see in the image below, to Iraq from 2004 to 2006 to provide support for rebuilding efforts. But it's important to note that even today, Japan's self-defense forces do not get involved in combat operations abroad. So next I'd like to talk about what's new about Japan's recent security policies and its security environment. I write in my new book, Japan's Security Renaissance, which will be released by Columbia University Press at the beginning of 2017, that there's a new openness to acting about new ideas of security in Japan today. And there's a flowering of new ways of thinking about security and a transformation in discourse across society about how Japan should best provide for its security. This is not to say that there's some new consensus that Japan should have a much larger military role in the world, but I think that we have seen in the past decade across elections that have brought into power more progressive parties like the Democratic Party of Japan and more conservative parties like the Liberal Democratic Party, that voters are showing a willingness for Japan to play a somewhat expanded regional security role, and for Japan's own self-defense forces to have some increased capabilities for a region that many Japanese are finding to be more dangerous. That said, by using this analogy of the Renaissance, I'm not meaning to imply that pre-Renaissance Japan was in some kind of dark ages. At least, that's not the view of most Japanese. Some Japanese, however, were quite resentful that Japan had such a limited military role during the Cold War and would like to see Japan play a larger role as a sense of national pride or patriotism. But I don't see this as the mainstream view in Japan or the primary driver for Japan's new security policies. So when I talk about a security renaissance in Japan, many people ask me, when did it begin? In my book, I talk about the security renaissance of the past decade, beginning with the first administration of Prime Minister Abe that began in 2006. But as I write in my book, the roots of this renaissance were always present in post-war Japan. But during most of the post-war period, popular opinion centered around anti-militarist security policies and a focus on economic growth. And because this is what popular opinion supported, this is also what democratic politics focused on. But this balance of military versus economic policy began to shift in the post-Cold War period, but this change was slow and strongly resisted by certain actors in Japan that did not want to see a larger military role for Japan in the region or worldwide. Japan's inability to contribute militarily to the 1990-91 Persian Gulf War created a big discussion in Japan about what Japan's post-Cold War security policies would look like, and what I call a gradual evolution in Japan's security policies over the next decade. Japan's popular Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, who became Prime Minister in 2001 and continued until 2008, saw significant changes in Japanese security policy, including what I mentioned before, the dispatch of the self-defense forces to Iraq, and prior to that, the dispatch of the maritime self-defense forces to the Indian Ocean to help in anti-terrorism activities related to Afghanistan. But more importantly, as we think about Japan's contemporary security policies, I'd like to discuss how we see Japan's security renaissance in today's Abe government, the government that began in December of 2012 and recently won yet another election in the upper house of Japan on July 10th of this year. We can see the security renaissance of Japan through a planning document called the National Defense Program Guidelines, or NDPG. These guidelines have been issued a number of times in the past, beginning in 1978, but recently two sets of these guidelines are particularly notable to see Japan's evolving security policies. In 2010, under the Democratic Party of Japan government, the guidelines were revised to shift resources militarily from the northern part of Japan, which used to address the threat from Russia or the Soviet Union, to the southwest to deal more with security concerns related to China. In addition, these guidelines set out an idea of what is called dynamic defense, of an ability for Japan to consider and plan for defense, not just in times of wartime, but also leading up to this period. These 2010 guidelines also set out the idea of jointness among Japan's self-defense forces. There are three branches of these forces: the air, the maritime, and the ground self-defense forces, and having them work together more effectively is an example of a serious and important change in Japan's security policies. In 2013, the Abe government issued revised guidelines once again, but these built largely on the ideas of the 2010 guidelines, although they further increased defense spending and further increased capabilities and institutional readiness of Japan's self-defense forces in the Ministry of Defense. In particular, the 2013 guidelines created a national security strategy and a National Security Council to better manage Japan's security policies, and new security practices such as what's called collective self-defense, and a relaxation of restrictions on Japan exporting weapons abroad, a relaxation on restrictions on using outer space for defense purposes, and a relaxation on restrictions on using Japan's robust overseas development assistance for military-related activities. This culminated in April of 2015 with revising the U.S.-Japan Guidelines for Defense Cooperation, which is a detailed planning document that sets out the way that the U.S.-Japan alliance would work in a number of security contingencies and also in terms of training and preparing for possible security actions in the future. Why have we seen these new security policies of Japan in the past decade? How do I explain the security renaissance and how it's unfolding? I'd like to point to two issues that I address in more detail in my book. First, Japan's domestic and international environment have dramatically changed in the past decade. As I mentioned before, China is now the #2 economy in the world and also the #2 defense spender in the world. In addition, other states in East Asia are rising, as I'll talk about in a moment. Domestically in Japan, there was a fall and then a resurgence of the conservative Liberal Democratic Party. This party lost power from 2009 to 2012, but now is back and is pushing a new security agenda. But at the same time, legacies of the past three in particular continue to shape Japan's security renaissance and its future security policies. There continue to be contested memories of the Pacific War and the years leading up to it, the period of Japanese colonialism. The post-war anti-militarist legacy in Japan, over 70 years of policies of restricting Japan's military and limited Japan's military engagement abroad, continues to cast a big shadow on Japan's current security policies and on its security future. Finally, the U.S.-Japan security alliance, that's been now resilient for over 65 years, continues to shape Japanese security present and Japan's security future, as I mentioned through the revision of the U.S.-Japan guidelines for defense cooperation. Anyone watching this short video will be aware of China's resurgence in East Asia. This slide shows China's phenomenal GDP growth in roughly the past 20 years, the period that the Chinese economy overtook the Japanese economy. As you can see, the US economy over doubled in economic size at this time as well, while Japan's economy largely stagnated. But China increased an astonishing 12 times size in this period. In addition, China's military spending has substantially increased in this period. In 1994, Japan was the second largest military spender in the world after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. In 2014, China is now the second largest military spender in the world, while Japan's military spending has largely stagnated. Note that US military spending in this period has over doubled, so Japan is the clear outlier in this area. Looking forward, China's economic size is expected to be 3 times that of Japan by 2030. This despite the fact that China only overtook the size of the Japanese economy in 2010. But it's not all about China. India and the 10 ASEAN countries also are expected to be equal size to the Japanese economy by 2030. Chinese military spending is now likely triple Japan's level of spending, despite having been less than half Japan's level in 1990, and China's spending continues to grow. But as I mentioned, it's not all about China. Other states in the region are also on the rise, economically and militarily. This graph shows Japan's GDP in relation to its neighbors from the end of the Cold War in 1989 up until 2012. As you can see, China has surpassed the Japanese economy. Looking further down on the graph, South Korea, Taiwan, and the ASEAN countries also show robust economic growth. Finally, in thinking about what's driving change in Japanese security policy, it's important to consider the changing global context. Security is becoming much more multipolar, not just in the Asian region, but globally. In the Asian region, it's not just about China and South Korea and Japan, but ASEAN and Russia, increasingly India and Australia. Beyond Asia, the European Union and the so-called G20 also are playing a greater security role. Moreover, states are no longer the only important actors. The U.S. defense community pays significant attention to non-state actors, such as Al-Qaeda, and to cyber threats. You might consider reading Joe Nye's The Future of Power to understand better the diffusion of power away from states and across a broader range of actors. Looking at Japan's security relations, there's increasingly a larger role for Japan to play with Australia, with India, and with ASEAN states. But in the case of Japanese security, it does often come back to the United States and our long military alliance between the United States and Japan. Former U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansfield, once described the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship as the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. And what he meant by this was not just a military alliance, but rather an extremely broad and multifaceted relationship. You can see on this slide a number of logos and slogans that show the depth of the U.S.-Japan relationship beyond just a military alliance. In U.S. strategy as well, our rebalance to Asia, what was once called the pivot to Asia, also dovetails nicely with Japanese military and economic objectives. As President Obama has said, The United States will of necessity rebalance toward the Asia-Pacific region because this is the future of growth and an area where we have increasing military concerns. Our relationships with Asian allies and key partners are critical to the future stability and growth in the region. And it continues to the security of the United States. This theme of a deeper security engagement with Asia is also present in Japan's first national security strategy, which was issued in December 2013. The U.S. rebalance or pivot to Asia includes diplomatic, economic, and military engagement, with an emphasis on three areas. First, strengthening and modernizing bilateral security alliances in the region. Second, deepening our working relationship with important partners and emerging powers, including Southeast Asian countries, India, and China. And third, engaging with regional multilateral institutions, including ASEAN. In considering next steps in Japanese security policy, the U.S.-Japan alliance looms large. As I mentioned earlier, the formal U.S.-Japan guidelines for defense cooperation were revised in April of 2015. This was announced after Prime Minister Abe visited Washington and made a rare address to a joint session of Congress on April 20th of 2015. More recently, President Obama, on his recent visit to Japan, visited Hiroshima in May of 2016, the first such visit by a sitting U.S. president. This exchange of visits and discussions of deepening our security ties shows the depth and the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance, and to some extent of Japan's own security policies. But security isn't just about guns. For both the United States and Japan, economic vitality is critical to continued influence in the region overall. And both states face challenges in this area that government policy plays a critical role in determining. The 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, was one effort in recent years to reinvigorate Japan's economy and regional economies in general. Although TPP's future currently is in doubt in Japan and elsewhere, including in the United States, the underlying idea that by working together and redoubling our economic vitality, we also increase our security continues to be an important concept. Another aspect of Japan's security, beyond just military security, is the troubling demographic imbalance that I mentioned at the outset of this lecture. Japan's combination of a low birth rate and an aging society puts tremendous pressure on the Japanese budget and on readiness of the self-defense forces. I hope that this brief overview of the security challenges Japan faces in 2016 and some of the important security policies it's implemented has answered your overall questions. I'd like to point to some other issues you might research further on your own. You might consider looking at Japan's first national security strategy document, which is available in English on the internet. If you're interested further in the U.S.-Japan alliance, you might read the revised U.S.-Japan guidelines for defense cooperation, also available online. I also encourage you to read more about challenges the United States and Japan face related to the U.S. military deployment in Okinawa, a region in the south of Japan that increasingly is critical of the concentration of U.S. forces in Okinawa. Over half of U.S. forces that are based in Japan are based in Okinawa, despite the Okinawan population being less than 1% of the Japanese population. Another area you might consider further is next steps in the relationship between Japan and China. Some worry about a war over this disputed territory, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands between Japan and China. Others worry about a possible trade war between Japan and China, given the escalating war of words over the territories and concerns of rising nationalism in both countries. Finally, as I mentioned at the outset of this lecture, there are quite a few broader security challenges that not just Japan but the region faces, related to North Korean nuclear policy and missile testing, a proliferation of terrorism, concern of rising nationalism across the region. On July 10th of this year, there was a national election in Japan, which for the first time led to a two-thirds majority of the conservative ruling coalition in both houses of Japan's parliament, the Diet. This means that there's a possibility that Japan's constitution might be revised in the near future, which could have important implications for Japan's security if the critical Article 9 of Japan's constitution were to be revised. There are many other areas of Japanese security policy that I find interesting and that you could explore on your own related to Japan's regional relations, challenges of new technology that are being faced, and the political challenges that the ruling party has in implementing its agenda. This slide shows some additional writings that go into greater depth about some of these issues if you'd like to read some more of my own work. Thanks for listening to my views, and good luck in the next steps of your own research or study about the issue of Japan or regional security in Asia.